Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome back to your family channel, Mr. Peter's Stories. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to say thank you from the bottom of my heart. The love, support, and prayers you shower upon me, Binta, and our entire family mean more than words can express. Binta is also sending her love, saying, God bless you all, and I say amen to that. Let's begin with a prayer. Heavenly Father, I come before you with a heart full of gratitude for this beautiful family you have given me. Thank you for each and every one of them, their kindness, their love, and their support. Bless them abundantly, Lord. Fill their lives with joy, peace, and endless love. Protect them and their families, guide their steps, and strengthen them in times of need. May their hearts always be filled with faith, hope, and happiness. Father, I also lift up those who are struggling today, those who are feeling lost, broken, or burdened. Wrap them in your loving arms and remind them they are never alone. Let your light shine upon them and give them the strength to overcome every challenge. In Jesus' name, I pray. Amen. My beautiful family, never forget, you are deeply loved, you are cherished, you are never alone. I am here for you, and together we will continue this journey of love, emotions, and unforgettable stories. To my new family members, welcome. You are now part of something special, a home filled with warmth, passion, and heartfelt moments. I promise you today's story will touch your soul. And speaking of stories, how was the last one? Did it move you? Did it make you feel something deep inside? Let me know, because your happiness is my greatest reward. Now, let's begin this journey together. Open your heart, take my hand, and let's dive into a story that will stay with you forever. I love you all so much. God bless you. The autumn winds swept through Manhattan as Brendan Guptill pushed open the heavy wooden doors of Columbia University's library. Golden rays of sunlight filtered through the towering windows, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. The familiar scent of aged paper and leather-bound books enveloped him as he adjusted his Italian silk tie, a small reminder of the corporate world he was trying to escape, if only for a few hours. At 32, Brendan had already made his mark on Wall Street. His office at Goldman Sachs overlooked the bustling financial district, a testament to his meteoric rise through the ranks. Yet here he was, seeking solitude among dusty tomes and whispered conversations, a world away from the frenetic energy of trading floors and boardrooms. That's when destiny intervened. Through the dancing motes of dust in the afternoon light, he saw her. Celine Stone sat alone at a corner table, her elegant fingers tracing lines in a worn copy of Pride and Prejudice. Her burgundy cashmere sweater complemented her radiant complexion, and her curly hair was pulled back in a sophisticated twist that accentuated the graceful curve of her neck. A pair of vintage tortoise-shell glasses perched delicately on her nose, adding an air of intellectual allure to her natural beauty. Brendan found himself frozen, briefcase hanging forgotten at his side. She turned a page with deliberate care, and the simple gesture held more grace than any choreographed dance he'd witnessed at New York's finest galas. Without conscious thought, his feet carried him toward her table. "Mind if I join you?" The words left his mouth before he could second-guess himself. All the other tables seemed to be occupied. It wasn't entirely true. There were several empty spots near the economics section, but something about her demanded proximity. She looked up, and Brendan felt the air leave his lungs. Her eyes were the color of aged whiskey and firelight, flecked with gold and warmth that seemed to peer directly into his soul. A slight smile played at the corners of her full lips, painted a subtle shade of rose that matched the blush rising in her cheeks. "Only if you promise not to disturb my reading," she teased, her voice carrying a hint of playfulness that belied the serious expression she was trying to maintain. She moved her stack of books aside, creating space at the massive oak table that suddenly felt intimately small. I wouldn't dare come between a woman and Jane Austen, he replied, setting down his briefcase with uncharacteristic care. His usual confidence wavered as she studied him with those remarkable eyes. Though I must admit it's refreshing to see someone reading the classics for pleasure rather than obligation. Her smile widened, and she placed a silk ribbon bookmark between the pages. You know Austen? Most men I meet proudly proclaim they've never read her, as if literary ignorance were a badge of honor. My mother was an English professor at Yale, he explained, settling into the chair across from her. I grew up surrounded by literature. Austen, Bronte, Hardy, they were my bedtime stories. He extended his hand across the table. Brendan Guptill. Celine Stone, she replied, her hand fitting perfectly in his. The touch sent an electric current through his body, and he found himself holding on a moment longer than strictly necessary. Architecture major, with a minor in art history. And you? Something tells me you're not a regular in this section of the library. Investment banking, he admitted, expecting to see the usual flicker of dollar signs in her eyes. Instead, she looked genuinely intrigued. Numbers by day, literature by night. A man needs balance in his life. A man of contradictions, she mused, removing her glasses and setting them aside. Without the lenses between them, her gaze was even more devastating. Tell me, Mr. Guptill, what brings an investment banker to the architecture section of the library? Surely the financial district has quieter spots for whatever work you're avoiding. Her perception startled a genuine laugh from him. Guilty as charged. The office can be overwhelming. Sometimes I need to remember there's more to life than quarterly reports and market projections. He gestured to her book. And please call me Brendan. Mr. Guptill is my father, and he'd be horrified to know I'm neglecting work to discuss 19th century literature. Their conversation flowed effortlessly, hours dissolving like sugar in hot tea. They discovered shared passions for classical music, French cinema, and hole-in-the-wall restaurants that served authentic ethnic cuisine. Celine's enthusiasm for architecture was infectious as she described her latest project, the restoration of a historic brownstone in the Upper West Side. It's about seeing the potential beneath the surface, she explained, sketching quick lines on a spare piece of paper to illustrate her point. These old buildings have souls, stories written in their foundations. My job is to honor those stories while writing new chapters. Brendan found himself leaning forward, entranced not just by her words, but by the way she spoke them, with passion, intelligence, and an artistic sensitivity that made his world of profit margins seem suddenly shallow. The afternoon light faded to dusk, and still they talked, their voices dropping to whispers as the library grew quieter around them. It wasn't until a stern-faced librarian approached to inform them the building was closing that they realized how much time had passed. As they gathered their belongings, their hands brushed accidentally, sending another jolt of electricity between them. I know this might seem forward, Brendan said as they descended the library's stone steps into the cool evening air. But would you like to continue this conversation over dinner? I know a small Italian place around the corner that makes tiramisu that would make Michelangelo weep. Celine hesitated, and for a moment Brendan's heart stopped. Then she smiled, and his world realigned. I'd like that, she said. Though I hope you realize you've set quite a high bar with that tiramisu claim. The restaurant, Bella Notte, was exactly as Brendan remembered it, intimate, authentic, with candles flickering in wine bottles and red checkered tablecloths that somehow managed to be charming rather than cliché. The owner, Giuseppe, greeted Brendan like a long-lost son and immediately whisked them to his best table in a quiet corner. As they settled in, Brendan noticed how the candlelight played across Celine's features, softening them and adding a glow that made her even more beautiful. She'd let her hair down, and the dark curls cascaded past her shoulders like a waterfall of silk. The sight made his breath catch in his throat. They ordered wine, a rich Barolo that Giuseppe insisted would make the stars shine brighter, and fell back into conversation as if they'd never left the library. Celine told him about growing up in Boston, about her father's construction company that had sparked her love of building, about her dreams of creating spaces that would outlive them both. Brendan found himself sharing things he'd never told anyone. His secret desire to write a novel, his fear that success meant nothing without purpose, the pressure of being the youngest senior analyst in his firm's history. With Celine, the carefully constructed walls he'd built around himself began to crumble. The tiramisu, when it arrived, lived up to its reputation. Brendan watched in amusement as Celine closed her eyes in bliss at the first bite, a small sound of pleasure escaping her lips that sent his imagination spinning in dangerous directions. "You were right," she conceded, pointing her fork at him accusingly, "though I suspect Michelangelo might have been more interested in sculpting it than eating it." Their laughter mingled with the soft Italian music playing in the background, creating a moment of perfect harmony. When their hands met across the table this time, there was nothing accidental about it. As they finally emerged from the restaurant hours later, the city had transformed. The streets glistened from a light rain that had fallen while they dined, and the lights of passing cars created dancing reflections on the wet pavement. Neither seemed eager to end the evening. "Let me walk you home," Brendan offered, already shrugging off his suit jacket to place it around her shoulders when he noticed her shiver. The gesture felt natural, inevitable, like everything else about their encounter. "Such a gentleman," she teased, but pulled the jacket closer, surrounding herself with his warmth and scent. "Though I should warn you, my apartment is in Greenwich Village. It's quite a walk." "Then we'll have plenty of time to finish our debate about whether Gatsby was truly great," he replied, offering his arm with an exaggerated flourish that made her laugh again, a sound he was quickly becoming addicted to. They walked arm in arm through the city streets, their pace unhurried despite the late hour. The conversation never lagged, but they also discovered the comfort of shared silences, moments when words seemed superfluous to the connection growing between them. At her doorstep, an elegant pre-war building with intricate stonework that Celine enthusiastically detailed, they faced each other in the soft glow of the entry lights. The air between them crackled with possibility. "Thank you for making me late to work tomorrow," she said softly, making no move to return his jacket or step away. "Thank you for giving me a reason to visit the library again," he responded, his voice equally quiet. His hand rose of its own accord to brush a stray curl from her cheek, and she leaned almost imperceptibly into his touch. The kiss, when it came, felt both inevitable and surprising. Her lips were soft, tasting of wine and tiramisu and possibility. Brendan's hands found her waist as hers slid up his chest to his shoulders, drawing them closer together. The world narrowed to this moment, this connection, this perfect convergence of chance and destiny. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Celine's eyes remained closed for a moment longer, as if memorizing the sensation. When she opened them, Brendan saw his own wonder reflected there. "Would you like to come up?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "For coffee, or—" The invitation hung in the air between them, heavy with promise. Every fibre of Brendan's being screamed to accept, to follow this magnetic pull between them to its natural conclusion. But something, perhaps the same instinct that had drawn him to her in the library, made him shake his head. "Not tonight," he said gently, pressing another soft kiss to her lips. "But I'd like to take you to dinner again. Tomorrow, if you're free." Her smile was radiant. "Tomorrow," she agreed, slipping his jacket from her shoulders and returning it with deliberate slowness. "Same time, same place. I'll be counting the minutes," he promised, and meant it. As he watched her disappear into the building, Brendan knew with absolute certainty that his life had irreversibly changed. This wasn't just attraction or chemistry, it was recognition, as if some part of his soul had finally found its missing piece. He walked home through the quiet streets of Manhattan, his mind full of golden eyes and musical laughter, of intellectual discourse and unspoken promises. For the first time in years, the numbers and strategies that usually occupied his thoughts were silent, replaced by poetry he thought he'd forgotten. Tomorrow couldn't come soon enough. Chapter 2. Love in Bloom. Spring arrived in New York City with a flourish of cherry blossoms and possibility. 3 months had passed since that fateful evening in the library, and Brendan and Celine's relationship had blossomed like the flowers in Central Park. Their daily lives had become a dance of stolen moments and passionate encounters, each one deepening their connection. The evening air was warm as Brendan waited outside Bella Notte, their now favorite restaurant. His fingers traced the small velvet box in his pocket. Not a ring, not yet, but a pair of vintage pearl earrings he'd found in an antique shop that reminded him of Celine's elegant taste. The city lights sparkled off the recently rain-washed streets, creating a magical atmosphere that matched his anticipation. Celine appeared like a vision through the misty evening, wearing a cream-colored dress that floated around her curves. Her hair was loose tonight, dark curls framing her face in the way that always made Brendan's heart skip a beat. As she approached, her smile illuminated the darkness better than any street lamp. "You look breathtaking," he said, drawing her close for a kiss that lingered just long enough to make Giuseppe, watching from inside, chuckle and shake his head. "And you," she replied, straightening his tie with familiar intimacy, "look like you've been plotting something. You have that mysterious gleam in your eye." Inside, their usual table awaited, complete with a bottle of their favorite Barolo already breathing. The candlelight cast intimate shadows across the checkered tablecloth as they settled into their seats, knees touching beneath the table in a way that sent electricity through both of them. "Tell me about your latest design," Brendan encouraged, watching her face light up with passion as she pulled out her sketchbook. Over the past months, he'd grown to love these moments when she shared her architectural visions with him. "It's a restoration project," she explained, spreading detailed drawings across the table. "This beautiful old brownstone from the 1890s. The owners want to modernize it while preserving its historic character." Her fingers traced the lines with the same care she'd shown that first day with her copy of Pride and Prejudice. "It's like solving a puzzle, finding the balance between past and present." "That's what I love about you," he said, reaching across the table to take her hand. "You see beauty in everything, even in broken things." She squeezed his hand, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that made the rest of the restaurant fade away. "Nothing's really broken, Brendan, just waiting to be reimagined." The evening progressed like a symphony, each moment building on the last. They shared stories of their day, his latest investment success, her breakthrough with a challenging client. Their conversation flowed as smoothly as the wine, punctuated by laughter and tender touches. After dinner, they walked through the city streets hand in hand, neither ready to end the evening. The spring air carried the scent of blooming flowers from nearby window boxes, and somewhere distant, a street musician played a jazz saxophone that floated on the breeze. "Come up for coffee?" Celine asked when they reached her building, though both knew coffee was the last thing on either of their minds. Inside her apartment, the city lights twinkled through the floor-to-ceiling windows she loved so much. Brendan had grown familiar with this space over the past months. The carefully curated art on the walls, the architectural models scattered across her work table, the comfortable mix of vintage and modern furniture that perfectly reflected its owner. "Wait," he said as she moved toward the kitchen. "I have something for you." Her eyes widened as he withdrew the velvet box from his pocket. "Brendan, don't worry," he assured her with a smile. "It's not that kind of box. Not yet." He opened it to reveal the pearl earrings, watching as her face softened with appreciation. "They're beautiful," she whispered, touching them gently, "like something from another era." "They reminded me of you," he said, helping her put them on. "Classic, elegant, timeless." She turned to look in the mirror, admiring how they caught the light. When she faced him again, her eyes were shining with emotion. "I love them," she said. "I love you." The words hung in the air between them, the first time either had spoken them aloud. Brendan's heart soared as he drew her into his arms. "I love you too," he murmured against her lips, "more than I thought possible." Their kiss deepened, filled with all the passion and tenderness that had been building between them. Celine's hands slid up his chest to his shoulders as his wrapped around her waist, pulling her closer. The city noise faded away until all they could hear was the sound of their hearts beating in sync. Later, as moonlight streamed through the windows, they lay entwined on her bed, the pearl earrings glinting on her nightstand. Brendan traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder, marveling at how perfectly they fit together. Her curls spread across his chest like a dark waterfall, and her skin glowed in the gentle light. "Tell me what you're thinking," she murmured, pressing a kiss to his collarbone. "I'm thinking about how lucky I am," he replied, running his fingers through her hair, "about how one random day in a library changed everything." She propped herself up on an elbow to look at him, her eyes full of love and mischief. "Random? I think not, Mr. Guptill. I'd seen you there before, you know, always in your perfect suits, looking so serious among the books." "You had?" He was genuinely surprised. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" "I was waiting for the right moment," she said with a smile, "for you to finally notice me." "I notice everything about you," he said, pulling her down for another kiss. "The way you bite your lip when you're concentrating on a design, how your eyes light up when you talk about architecture, the little sigh you make when you're perfectly content." As if on cue, she made that very sigh, settling back against his chest. "We fit," she said simply, "like pieces of a puzzle I didn't even know I was trying to solve. Their differences, which might have driven others apart, only seemed to strengthen their bond." His structured world of finance complemented her creative spirit. Where he saw numbers and patterns, she saw possibilities and potential. Together, they created a harmony neither had known they were missing. The night deepened around them as they talked about everything and nothing, their dreams, their fears, their hopes for the future. Brendan found himself sharing thoughts he'd never voiced to anyone else, about his desire to make a difference beyond just making money, about his secret wish to write a novel someday. Celine listened with complete attention, offering insights that showed how deeply she understood him. In turn, she shared her own vulnerabilities, her worry that her artistic vision might not be enough in the competitive world of New York architecture, her struggle to balance creativity with practicality. As dawn began to paint the sky in soft pastels, they finally drifted to sleep, wrapped in each other's arms. The last thing Brendan saw before closing his eyes was Celine's peaceful face, and he knew with absolute certainty that this was what happiness felt like. The next few months passed in a blur of beautiful moments. They developed routines that felt as natural as breathing. Sunday brunches at their favorite cafe, evening walks through Central Park, lazy mornings spent reading the newspaper together in bed. Yet each day brought new discoveries, new reasons to fall deeper in love. Brendan found himself leaving little surprises in Celine's apartment, fresh flowers on her drafting table, her favorite chocolates by her coffee maker, handwritten notes quoting poetry he remembered from his mother's lessons. Celine responded with her own gestures, sketching his profile while he worked at her dining table, cooking his favorite meals when he had difficult days at the office, sending him architectural drawings of their future dream home. Their friends noticed the change in them. Brendan's colleagues commented on his lighter mood, the way he now left the office at reasonable hours instead of working until midnight. Celine's artistic friends remarked on how her designs had taken on new depth and emotion, as if her personal happiness had found its way into her professional creativity. One particularly memorable evening, they hosted a dinner party for their closest friends. Celine had spent hours preparing her grandmother's recipes, filling her apartment with the scents of herbs and spices. Brendan watched her move around the kitchen with grace and confidence, falling in love with her all over again. Their guests included Alexandra Martinez, who had become their biggest supporter. She watched them throughout the evening with knowing eyes, noting how they moved in perfect synchronization, anticipating each other's needs without a word. "You two," she declared after several glasses of wine, "are disgustingly perfect together. It's like watching a romance novel come to life." Brendan and Celine exchanged amused glances, but neither could deny the truth in her words. They had found something rare and precious, a love that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. As spring turned to summer, their relationship deepened further. They began spending more time at Brendan's penthouse apartment, its sleek modern lines softened by Celine's influence, colourful throw pillows, artistic photographs, vases of fresh flowers. His space, like his life, was transformed by her presence. One weekend, they took a spontaneous trip to the Hamptons, renting a beachfront cottage that combined their tastes, historic architecture with contemporary comforts. They spent hours walking on the beach, talking about their future, making plans that felt both exciting and inevitable. "I want to build something lasting," Celine told him as they watched the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. "Something that stands the test of time." "Like us?" Brendan pulled her close, kissing her temple. "Exactly like us," she replied, turning in his arms to face him. "We're creating our own masterpiece, aren't we?" "The best kind," he agreed, "one that gets more beautiful every day." That night, as they lay in bed, listening to the waves crash against the shore, Brendan realized he was ready for the next step. Not just ready, eager. He wanted to make their connection permanent, to build a life with this extraordinary woman who had transformed his world. Back in the city, he began secretly visiting jewelers, searching for a ring that would be worthy of Celine. It had to be perfect, unique, yet timeless, like their love. He found himself studying the architectural details of the buildings she admired, wanting the ring to reflect her aesthetic sensibilities. Their love continued to bloom like the flowers in Central Park, each day bringing new joys and discoveries. Their differences, which might have created distance, instead fostered growth and understanding. Brendan learned to see the world through Celine's artistic eyes, while she gained appreciation for the elegant precision of his financial world. They were building something extraordinary together, a love story written in shared glances and tender touches, in passionate kisses and quiet moments of understanding. Like the buildings Celine restored, their relationship had a solid foundation but remained open to endless possibilities. The future stretched before them, full of promise and potential, waiting to be shaped by their combined vision. They were architects of their own destiny, creating a love that would indeed stand the test of time. Chapter 3. Dreams and Promises. The Victorian mansion overlooking the Hudson River stood like a testament to enduring love. Its restored facade gleamed in the late afternoon sun, every architectural detail meticulously brought back to life under Celine's careful direction. Today, it would witness another restoration, not of brick and mortar, but of two souls joining as one. Brendan stood in one of the mansion's elegant rooms, adjusting his bow tie for the 100th time. Through the tall windows, he could see guests arriving, making their way up the curved pathway that Celine had lined with vintage lanterns. His heart raced with anticipation, knowing that somewhere in this magnificent building his bride was preparing for their moment. In her preparation suite, Celine sat at an antique vanity, watching as her mother secured the last pearl pin in her hair. The vintage-inspired wedding dress she'd designed herself lay carefully draped across a chaise lounge, its delicate lace and flowing lines a perfect blend of classic and contemporary, just like their love. Alexandra Martinez, their mutual friend and maid of honor, appeared in the doorway, her emerald green dress rustling softly. "It's almost time," she said, her eyes glistening with happy tears. "Are you ready?" Celine's reflection smiled back at her, radiant with joy and anticipation. "I've been ready since that first day in the library," she replied, standing to step into her dress. The gown transformed her into something ethereal. The silk charmeuse flowed like water over her curves, while the vintage lace overlay told stories of romances past and present. Her mother gasped softly, pressing a hand to her heart. "You look like a dream," Alexandra whispered, helping to arrange the train. "Brendan won't know what hit him." In his room, Brendan reached into his pocket, touching the folded paper containing his vows. He'd rewritten them dozens of times, trying to find words worthy of their love. How could mere language capture the way Celine had transformed his world? How could he express the depth of his commitment to their shared future? A knock at the door revealed his best man, James, holding 2 glasses of aged scotch. "Traditional Dutch courage," he said with a grin, handing one to Brendan. "Though I doubt you need it. I've never seen 2 people more certain about anything." Brendan accepted the glass, thinking about the journey that had led them here. Every moment, every decision, every twist of fate had been leading to this day. He remembered their first kiss on her doorstep, the way she'd looked in the candlelight at Bella Notte, the joy in her eyes when he'd proposed in the library where they'd first met. The ceremony space took everyone's breath away. Celine had transformed the mansion's grand ballroom into a magical setting that honored both the building's history and their personal story. Vintage books served as centerpieces, their pages opened to passages about love. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over arrangements of white roses and ivy, while architectural sketches of famous romance-inspired buildings decorated the walls. As the string quartet began to play, Brendan took his place at the altar. The afternoon sun streamed through the restored stained glass windows, creating patterns of colored light across the hardwood floors. His heart thundered in his chest as the doors opened and the bridal procession began. Alexandra appeared first, carrying a bouquet of white roses and eucalyptus. She winked at Brendan as she took her place, her eyes saying, "Just wait until you see her." Then the music changed, and time seemed to stop. Celine appeared in the doorway on her father's arm, and Brendan forgot how to breathe. She was luminous, ethereal, a vision in white and vintage lace. Her dark curls were swept up elegantly, secured with pearl pins that caught the light. The dress she'd designed hugged her curves before flowing out like a waterfall of silk and dreams. Their eyes met across the room, and everything else faded away. In that moment, it was just the 2 of them, surrounded by love and possibility. Tears welled in Brendan's eyes as he watched her approach, each step bringing them closer to their shared future. When she reached him, her father placed her hand in his with a warmth that welcomed Brendan to the family. Celine's fingers trembled slightly in his grasp, and he squeezed them gently, grounding them both in the moment. "You're stunning," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "So are you," she replied softly, her eyes shining with unshed tears of joy. The officiant began the ceremony, but they barely heard the words. They were lost in each other's eyes, communicating volumes without speaking. When it came time for their vows, Brendan spoke first, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed room. "I, Brendan, take you, Celine, to be my wife," he began, his voice steady despite the emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "I promise to be your partner in all things, to support your dreams as if they were my own, and to love you through all the renovations life may require." A ripple of appreciative laughter moved through the guests at his architectural reference. Celine's eyes sparkled as she began her own vows. "I, Celine, take you, Brendan, to be my husband. I promise to be your sanctuary, to help you find beauty in the chaos, and to build a life with you that's stronger than any foundation I've ever designed. I promise to love you through all seasons, to grow with you through all changes, and to always see the potential in our shared future." They exchanged rings, his a classic platinum band, hers a vintage Art Deco piece they'd found together in an antique shop. As they slipped them onto each other's fingers, both felt the weight of tradition and promise they represented. "By the power vested in me," the officiant proclaimed, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." Their first kiss as a married couple was gentle yet passionate, filled with all the love and promise of their future together. The guests erupted in applause, but Brendan and Celine remained in their own world for a moment longer, foreheads pressed together, sharing breath and joy. The reception that followed was a perfect blend of elegance and warmth. Giuseppe from Bella Notte had catered the event, creating a feast that celebrated their story. The tiramisu wedding cake was his special gift to them, decorated with architectural details that matched the mansion's facade. Alexandra's toast brought both laughter and tears. "I watched these two fall in love," she said, raising her champagne glass. "I saw how they completed each other, how they made each other better. Brendan became more passionate about life, while Celine found new appreciation for structure and stability. They prove that true love isn't about finding someone perfect. It's about finding someone who makes you want to be your best self." As the evening progressed, they shared their first dance to La Vie en Rose, swaying together as the string quartet played. Brendan held Celine close, breathing in the scent of her perfume, memorizing every detail of this perfect moment. "Happy?" he murmured against her temple. "Completely," she replied, tilting her face up to his. "I feel like we're in our own fairy tale." "Better than a fairy tale," he said, spinning her gently. "This is real. This is us." Later, as the party continued around them, they snuck away to one of the mansion's balconies. The Hudson River reflected the stars and city lights, creating a magical backdrop for their moment alone. "I can't believe we did it," Celine said, leaning back against Brendan's chest as his arms wrapped around her waist. "We actually got married in my restoration project." "It's perfect," he replied, pressing a kiss to her neck. "Every detail tells our story." They stood there in comfortable silence, watching the lights dance on the water. The sounds of their celebration drifted up from below, laughter, music, joy. But in this moment, they were content to just be together, feeling the weight of their rings and the promise of their future. "What are you thinking about?" Brendan asked, noticing the thoughtful look on Celine's face. "About all the chapters we're going to write together," she replied, turning in his arms to face him. "About the home we'll build, the family we'll create, the life we'll share." "I love you," he said simply, capturing her lips in a tender kiss. "I love you too," she whispered against his mouth. "Forever." They rejoined their guests for more dancing, more champagne, more celebration of their love. The night seemed to stretch endlessly, filled with moments they would treasure forever, dancing with their parents, cutting the cake, laughing with friends, stealing kisses whenever they could. As the evening drew to a close, they made their way through a shower of rose petals to the vintage Rolls-Royce, waiting to take them to their honeymoon suite at the plaza. Celine's parents had insisted on this traditional touch, and now, sitting in the luxurious back seat, they were grateful for this moment of peace. "Mrs. Guptill," Brendan said, testing the sound of it as he raised her hand to his lips. "I like how that sounds," Celine replied, curling into his side. "Though I'm keeping stone professionally, can't let go of my architectural reputation." "You can have any name you want," he assured her, "as long as you're my wife." The plaza welcomed them with its usual grandeur, but they barely noticed. They were too lost in each other, in the reality of being husband and wife, in the promise of their wedding night and all the nights to follow. In their suite, Brendan opened champagne while Celine disappeared into the bathroom to freshen up. When she emerged, she had removed her wedding gown, replacing it with a silk negligee that made his heart stop. "You are the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," he said, drawing her into his arms. "More beautiful than a perfectly balanced portfolio," she teased, her fingers working on his bow tie. "Than anything," he replied, capturing her lips in a passionate kiss. They made love with tender passion, celebrating their union in the most intimate way possible. Afterward, they lay tangled in the luxurious sheets, sharing whispered dreams and promises for their future. "This is just the beginning," Celine said, tracing patterns on his chest. "Of our greatest adventure," Brendan agreed, pulling her closer. As they drifted off to sleep, both felt an overwhelming sense of rightness. They had found their perfect match, their true partner, their other half. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, building their life with the same care and attention to detail that had marked their courtship. Their love story was far from over. It was just beginning a new chapter, one filled with promise and possibility. Like the building Celine restored, their marriage would be built on a strong foundation, designed with care and filled with beautiful details that would stand the test of time. Chapter 4. The First Cracks. The first hairline fractures in their marriage appeared gradually, like small imperfections in a seemingly flawless foundation. It began during their third year together, as both their careers entered crucial growth phases. Brendan had been steadily climbing the ranks at Goldman Sachs, his natural talent for finance catching the attention of senior partners. Meanwhile, Celine's architectural firm had begun taking on increasingly prestigious restoration projects. Spring bled into summer, and their penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park grew quieter. The passionate discussions that once filled their evenings were gradually replaced by the soft hum of laptops and the gentle tick of the antique clock Celine had restored during their first year of marriage. The pivotal moment came when Brendan was approached for a potential promotion to senior vice president. The opportunity was unprecedented for someone his age. At 35, he would be the youngest SVP in the firm's history. But it came with a catch. He would need to head the prestigious Shanghai merger, a deal that would require months of intense work and frequent travel. "This is huge," he told Celine one evening, his eyes bright with excitement as he paced their living room. "The partners specifically requested me for this. Do you know what this could mean for us?" Celine sat on their Italian leather sofa, watching her husband's animated movements. She wanted to share his enthusiasm, but something held her back. "How much travel are we talking about?" "Just a few trips to Shanghai," he said quickly. "Too quickly. Maybe once a month for the first phase. The rest can be handled from here." She nodded slowly, remembering similar promises about previous projects. "And the hours. They'll be long initially," he admitted. "But once the deal is structured, things will calm down. 6 months, maybe 8 at most." That was the first crack, not in what he said, but in what remained unspoken. They both knew, initially, could stretch indefinitely, that 6 months often became a year or more. But neither voiced these concerns, letting them sink beneath the surface of their relationship like stones in a still pond. The changes came subtly at first. Brendan began arriving home later, his mind still wrapped in complex financial calculations, even when he was physically present. Celine found herself spending more evenings alone, her dinner preparations growing simpler as solo meals became the norm rather than the exception. One particularly late evening, she sat at their dining table, the candles burned low beside an untouched meal she'd prepared hours ago. She wore the emerald silk dress she'd bought for their anniversary, her dark curls arranged elegantly, though some had escaped to frame her face in the hours of waiting. The sound of keys in the door made her look up. Brendan entered, loosening his tie as he set down his briefcase. Exhaustion was etched in every line of his face, but it wasn't just physical tiredness. There was a distance in his eyes that hadn't been there in their early days. "You missed dinner again," she said softly, her voice carrying no anger, only a deep sadness that cut through his fatigue. "I'm sorry," he replied automatically, then registered her dress, the candles, the careful table setting. Real regret flashed across his features. The Shanghai team needed updated projections and the time difference. "I know, Brendan. Everything's always important for your career." She stood, gathering the untouched plates. The candlelight caught the tears she was trying to hide. "But what about us? When was the last time we had a real conversation that wasn't about work?" "That's not fair," he protested, following her to the kitchen. "I'm doing this for us, for our future. This merger could set us up for life." "Are you?" She turned to face him, and the pain in her eyes made him step back. "Sometimes I wonder if you even remember why we fell in love." The words hung between them like shattered glass. Brendan reached for her, but she moved away, busying herself with cleaning up the dinner she'd prepared hours ago. "Of course I remember," he said softly. "How could I forget? You were reading Pride and Prejudice in the library. You were wearing that burgundy sweater that made your skin glow. You teased me about being an investment banker in the architecture section." "That was a lifetime ago," she whispered, her back still turned. "We were different people then." As if to prove her point, his phone buzzed with another message from Shanghai. The sound seemed to fill the kitchen, a technological intrusion into what should have been an intimate moment. Brendan's hand twitched toward his pocket, an unconscious gesture that didn't go unnoticed. "Go ahead," Celine said quietly. "It might be important." "No," he said firmly, though his fingers still itched to check the message. "This is more important. You're more important." But even as he said it, they both felt the weight of all the times he'd made the opposite choice, all the moments when work had taken precedence over their relationship. The next morning, they moved around each other in a careful dance, their routine perfectly choreographed to minimize interaction. Celine was up first, dressed impeccably in a tailored suit that emphasized her elegant figure. She'd made coffee, but left before Brendan had his first cup. Their text messages throughout the day were practical, logistical. "Working late tonight, don't wait up." "Okay, me too." Client meeting ran long. "Did you call the plumber about the leak? Handled it? Bills on your desk?" Gone were the loving messages they used to send, the random thoughts and quotes they used to share. Their communication had become as efficient and impersonal as their lives. The pattern continued for weeks. Brendan's involvement in the Shanghai merger grew more intense, while Celine took on a challenging restoration project for the historic Williams Theatre. They existed in parallel, their paths crossing briefly in the mornings and late at night. Their apartment became a shared space rather than a home, filled with expensive furniture but lacking the warmth it once had. One Saturday afternoon, Brendan came home early, hoping to surprise Celine. He found her in her home office, surrounded by architectural drawings and material samples. She'd been crying, though she quickly wiped away the evidence when she heard him enter. "What's wrong?" he asked, genuine concern breaking through his usual professional demeanor. "Nothing," she said quickly, shuffling papers on her desk. "Just stressed about the Williams project. The Historical Commission is being difficult about the modernization plans." He moved behind her, placing his hands on her shoulders. She tensed briefly before relaxing into his touch, and the small gesture of resistance felt like another crack in their foundation. "Can I help?" he offered, massaging the tension from her shoulders. "Unless you can convince the Commission that updating the heating system won't destroy the building's historical integrity, probably not," she sighed, leaning back against him. For a moment they were close again, physically and emotionally. The scent of her jasmine perfume enveloped him, bringing back memories of happier times. But then, both their phones buzzed simultaneously, his with news from Shanghai, hers with updates from her contractor. "I have to take this," they said in unison, and the irony of it hung heavy in the air between them. That night, lying awake in their bed, Brendan stared at the ceiling and tried to pinpoint exactly when things had started to change. Was it the promotion, the increasing demands of their careers, or had they simply grown in different directions, like two trees reaching for different patches of sunlight? Beside him, Celine stirred restlessly, caught in her own troubled dreams. Even in sleep, worry creased her brow. He resisted the urge to smooth it away, afraid of waking her, afraid of the distance he might see in her eyes. Their love hadn't died, it was still there, burning beneath the surface of their busy lives. But it had changed, transformed from the all-consuming passion of their early days into something more complicated, more fragile. Like the buildings Celine restored, their relationship needed careful attention, needed someone to see the beauty beneath the cracks and believe in its potential for renewal. But both of them were too busy building other things to notice their own foundation starting to crumble. Chapter 5. Growing Apart. The distance between them grew like ivy on an abandoned building, slow but persistent, each tendril of separation wrapping around their once solid foundation. Their penthouse apartment, which had been a testament to their shared dreams, now felt more like a museum of what they'd lost, each room holding memories that grew dustier by the day. Summer faded into autumn, and with it came Brendan's official promotion to senior vice president. The Shanghai merger had consumed his life entirely, turning their home into an extension of his office. Financial reports cluttered every surface, and the soft glow of his laptop often illuminated their bedroom until dawn. Celine's architecture firm was flourishing, but success brought its own complications. The Williams Theatre restoration had become her sanctuary, a place where she could lose herself in the challenge of breathing new life into forgotten beauty. She spent long hours at the historic site, finding more comfort in its crumbling walls than in their perfectly appointed home. One rain-soaked evening, she returned to find Brendan actually home before her, an increasingly rare occurrence. He sat in his home office, surrounded by papers and empty coffee cups, his tie loosened, but still knotted at his throat. "I got the Williams contract finalized," she said softly from the doorway, hoping to share her triumph with him. "The Historical Commission approved all our proposed modifications." "Oh, that's nice," he replied, barely looking up from his computer screen. The blue light reflected off his reading glasses, creating a barrier between them as effectively as a wall. "Nice?" The word felt like a slap. "Brendan, this is the biggest project of my career. I've been talking about it for weeks." He finally turned to face her, frustration evident in his features. "I'm sorry, Celine, but I can't keep track of every project. Some of us are dealing with billion-dollar mergers here." The words hung between them like poison. Celine stepped back as if physically struck, her portfolio clutched to her chest like a shield. "Right. Because my work is just playing with buildings, isn't it? Not important enough for the great Brendan Guptill's attention." She retreated to her own home office, the space she'd carved out for herself at the other end of their apartment. Once, they joked about being able to work from home together, stealing kisses between meetings and sharing ideas over lunch. Now, their separate offices stood like opposing fortresses, territories marked by their respective ambitions. Their lives continued to diverge in subtle ways. Brendan joined an exclusive gym near his office, working out at dawn before his early morning calls with Shanghai. Celine started taking evening yoga classes, finding peace in the meditation that eluded her at home. Even their meal preferences shifted. He developed a taste for high-end sushi delivered to his office, while she found comfort in the home-style Italian cooking she'd grown up with. One Sunday morning, Celine woke to find Brendan already dressed for a meeting, though the sun had barely risen. He stood at their bedroom window, his silhouette cut sharp against the rising light. "I thought we could have brunch today," she said, her voice still husky with sleep. "Like we used to at that little place in the village." "Can't," he replied, checking his phone. "The Shanghai team needs updated projections before the Asian markets open." "It's Sunday, Brendan. The market doesn't care what day it is." He paused, finally looking at her. "You look tired. You should get more rest." "I look tired because I was hoping my husband might actually be home for dinner last night. I waited until 10. You should have texted. I had a late dinner with the partners." "I did text, 3 times. She sat up in bed, the silk sheets pooling around her waist. "Did you even read them?" He had the grace to look embarrassed, pulling out his phone to check. The messages were there, each one a little more resigned than the last. "Made your favorite pasta. Home by 7? Food's getting cold. Everything okay. Don't worry about dinner. I'm going to bed." "I'm sorry," he said, but the words felt hollow, worn smooth by overuse. "Things are just crazy right now with the merger." "Things have been crazy for months, Brendan. They're not getting better, they're getting worse." He moved to sit on the edge of the bed, maintaining a careful distance between them. "This deal could make my career. Just a few more months. That's what you said 3 months ago, and 3 months before that." She turned away, unable to bear the sight of him in his perfectly pressed suit, ready to leave her for another day of endless meetings. "Do you even remember what we used to be like?" "Of course I do. But we have to think about our future." "What future?" She looked back at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "We're not building a future together anymore. We're building separate lives that happen to share an address." The truth of her words hit him hard, but before he could respond, his phone buzzed with another message from Shanghai. The moment shattered as he reached for it instinctively. "Go," she said quietly. "Your other life is calling." He hesitated for a moment, torn between his wife and his responsibilities. But in the end, he did what he'd been doing for months. He chose work. After he left, Celine lay in their bed, surrounded by expensive sheets that felt cold despite their high thread count. She remembered how they used to spend Sunday mornings here, reading the paper together, sharing coffee and dreams. Now the bed felt too big, the room too quiet. She got up and dressed for yoga, needing to escape the emptiness of their home. As she gathered her mat and water bottle, she caught sight of their wedding photo on the dresser. They looked so young, so in love, so certain that their love could conquer anything. The yoga studio became her refuge, a place where she could focus on her breath and forget about the growing void in her marriage. Her instructor often spoke about finding balance, about the importance of foundation in every pose. The irony wasn't lost on her. She spent her days restoring foundations of buildings while her own personal foundation crumbled. One evening, after a particularly challenging class, her instructor kept her behind. "Your energy is troubled," the older woman said kindly. Your poses are perfect, but your spirit is fighting itself. Celine tried to smile, but tears welled up instead. Is it that obvious? Only to someone who's been there. The instructor patted her hand. Sometimes we have to acknowledge the cracks before we can repair them. But acknowledging the cracks meant facing the possibility that some damage couldn't be repaired. That night, Celine stayed late at the Williams Theatre site, walking through the empty halls, running her hands along the walls that had witnessed a century of stories. The building had survived wars, economic downturns, and decades of neglect. Yet here it stood, waiting to be restored. If only love were as straightforward as architecture, she whispered to the silent space. When she finally returned home, Brendan was there, a rare occurrence these days. He sat in the darkness of their living room, illuminated only by the city lights streaming through their floor-to-ceiling windows. You're home late, he said, his voice carefully neutral. So are you, she replied, equally careful. No calls from Shanghai? They can wait until morning. He stood, moving toward her like a man approaching a wild animal, afraid she might bolt. We need to talk. But before he could continue, his phone lit up with an incoming call. They both stared at it, watching as the Shanghai office number flashed on the screen. They can wait until morning. Celine's laugh was bitter. Nothing waits anymore, Brendan. Everything's urgent, everything's crucial, everything's more important than us. She turned away, retreating to her home office, leaving him standing there with his ringing phone and the weight of choices not made. Their love hadn't died. It was still there, burning beneath the surface of their busy lives. But it had changed, transformed from the all-consuming passion of their early days into something more complicated, more fragile. Like the building Celine restored, it needed careful attention, needed someone to see the beauty beneath the cracks and believe in its potential for renewal. But both of them were too busy building other things to notice their own foundation starting to crumble, too caught up in their separate successes to see their shared failure. The distance between them grew day by day, measured not in feet or inches, but in missed dinners, unreturned calls, and dreams that no longer aligned. Chapter 6. The Breaking Point. The argument that ended their marriage began like any other, small, insignificant, a tiny spark that ignited the kindling of resentment they'd gathered over years. It was a crisp autumn evening, eerily similar to the night they'd first met, when everything finally shattered. Brendan had actually made it home early, hoping to surprise Celine with tickets to the symphony, an attempt to reconnect, to recapture some of their old magic. He found her in their walk-in closet, methodically packing a suitcase. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice catching in his throat as he watched her fold one of her favorite dresses, the burgundy one she'd worn on their first anniversary. "The Historical Commission approved my plans for the Williams Theatre," she said, without turning around. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed the fabric. "They want me to oversee the restoration personally. I'll be in Boston for the next 3 weeks." 3 weeks? The symphony tickets felt heavy in his pocket. "You didn't mention this before." "I tried." Now she did turn, and the sadness in her eyes struck him like a physical blow. "Last week at dinner, and the week before that. But you were always on calls, always distracted. Eventually I stopped trying." The truth of her words hit him hard. How many conversations had he missed? How many moments had slipped away while he was lost in his world of mergers and acquisitions? "I can't live like this anymore," Celine continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're living parallel lives, Brendan. We're not partners anymore. We're just two people sharing an address." "What do you want from me?" he demanded, frustration bleeding into his tone. The careful control he maintained in boardrooms, cracking under the weight of impending loss. "I'm working to give us everything we dreamed of." "No, You're working to prove something to yourself, and I'm tired of being collateral damage in your quest for success." Her hands went to her neck, unfastening the delicate gold chain he'd given her on their wedding day. She placed it on his desk with deliberate care. "I want a divorce." The word echoed in the room like a gunshot. Brendan stared at the necklace, its small pendant catching the light like a tear. "Celine, please. We built this marriage on a foundation of love," she said, and now tears were falling freely down her cheeks. "But we forgot to maintain it. Now it's too damaged to repair." "That's not true," he insisted, moving toward her. "We can fix this. I'll cut back at work. "You said that 6 months ago," she interrupted. "And a year before that. Nothing changed. Nothing ever changes." She turned back to her packing, but Brendan caught her arm, spinning her to face him. For a moment, they were close enough to kiss, close enough that he could smell her jasmine perfume, see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes. His heart thundered in his chest as memories flooded back. Their first meeting in the library, their wedding dance, countless moments of joy and passion and love. "I still love you," he said softly, his voice rough with emotion. "I know," she replied, reaching up to touch his face one last time. "That's what makes this so hard. Love isn't our problem, Brendan. It never was. But love isn't enough when you're growing in different directions." She stepped back, breaking contact, and the space between them felt infinite. "I called a lawyer last week. She'll be sending over the papers." "Just like that?" Anger flared through his grief. "You're throwing away 5 years of marriage without even trying to fix it." "Trying?" Now it was her turn to be angry. I've been trying to talk to you, trying to reach you, trying to save us for years, but you're never really here, even when you're physically present. Your mind is always on the next deal, the next merger, the next mountain to climb." She gestured around their luxurious bedroom, at all the trappings of success they'd accumulated. "Look at all this, Brendan. We have everything we thought we wanted, but somewhere along the way, we lost what we actually needed." The truth of her words struck him silent. He watched as she continued packing, each carefully folded piece of clothing, another brick in the wall rising between them. When had their dreams become obstacles? When had success become more important than happiness? "Remember our first apartment?" she asked suddenly, holding a simple cotton dress she'd worn back then. That tiny walk-up in the village with the temperamental heating and the view of the brick wall. "Of course I remember," he said softly. "We could barely afford the rent, but we were happy." "We were," she smiled sadly. "We had nothing but dreams and each other. And somehow, that felt like more than all of this." She gestured around their penthouse, at the expensive furniture and designer decor that had replaced their eclectic thrift store finds. Everything was perfect, polished, cold. "I miss that couple," she whispered. "I miss who we were before we became who we thought we should be." Brendan sank onto their bed, suddenly exhausted. "When did we lose our way?" "Gradually," Celine replied, zipping her suitcase closed with a finality that felt symbolic. "So gradually we didn't notice until we were completely lost." She moved to their dresser, beginning to sort through her jewelry. Each piece she removed seemed to carry a memory: the pearl earrings he'd given her when they first started dating, the bracelet from their first Christmas together, the rings. Her hands hesitated over her wedding ring. With trembling fingers, she slipped it off, placing it beside the necklace on his desk. The small clink of metal on wood seemed to echo in the silence. "I can't do this," Brendan said, standing abruptly. "I can't just watch you walk away." "Then don't watch," she replied softly. "Go to the office, bury yourself in work. Isn't that what you always do when things get difficult?" The accusation stung because it was true. How many times had he retreated to his office rather than face their problems? How many opportunities to connect had he sacrificed at the altar of ambition? "That's not fair," he protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "No, it's not fair," she agreed. "None of this is fair, but it's reality, our reality, the one we created choice by choice, absence by absence." She looked around their bedroom one last time, her eyes lingering on the photographs that tracked their journey from passionate young lovers to successful but disconnected professionals. "I'll have someone come for the rest of my things while you're at work. It's better this way." "Better for who?" he demanded, anger flaring again. "You're making this decision for both of us." "No, Brendan, you made this decision. Every time you chose work over us, every time you missed a dinner or cancelled a weekend away, every time you were physically present but mentally absent, you were choosing this ending." She picked up her suitcase, her movements graceful even in this moment of devastation. "I'm just finally accepting it." At the bedroom door, she paused. For a moment, Brendan thought she might change her mind, might turn back and give them another chance. But when she spoke, her words were soft and final. "I hope you find what you're looking for," she said. "I hope all of this turns out to be worth what it cost." Then she was gone, her footsteps echoing through their apartment one last time. Brendan stood frozen until he heard the front door close, then collapsed onto their bed. No, his bed now. The silence that followed was deafening. He could still smell her perfume on the pillows, still see traces of her presence everywhere he looked. The walk-in closet door stood open, the empty spaces in her side like missing teeth in a familiar smile. His phone buzzed. Shanghai again, always Shanghai. But for once, he didn't answer. Instead, he walked to his desk and picked up her wedding ring, still warm from her finger. How had they gone from that perfect day in the Victorian mansion to this moment of absolute loss? The symphony tickets fell from his pocket as he sat heavily in his office chair. Mozart's Requiem, her favorite piece. He'd thought it might be a way to bridge the gap between them, a reminder of the culture and passion they used to share. Now, it felt like a requiem for their marriage instead. That night, Brendan didn't sleep. He wandered their apartment like a ghost, seeing memories in every corner. There they were, dancing in the living room after closing on the penthouse, making breakfast together in the kitchen on lazy Sunday mornings, planning their future on the balcony under starlit skies. When dawn finally broke over the Manhattan skyline, he made 2 calls. The first was to his office, informing them he wouldn't be in today. The second was to their mutual friend, Alexandra, who answered despite the time difference in Australia. "She's gone," was all he could say before his voice broke. "Oh, Brendan," Alexandra sighed, her voice carrying across oceans. "I was wondering when one of you would finally break. I didn't think. I never thought." "That's the problem," she said gently. "You stopped thinking about what really mattered. Both of you did, in different ways." He spent the day in a haze, alternating between grief and anger, between desperate plans to win Celine back and resigned acceptance that she was right. They had lost their way so gradually, so completely, that finding their way back might be impossible. The divorce proceedings were civil, but cold. They divided their assets with the precision Brendan used in his financial deals and the attention to detail Celine applied to her blueprints. Friends chose sides, social circles shifted, and Alexandra watched helplessly from Australia as the couple she'd once bet on fell apart. In the end, it wasn't the dramatic scenes from movies, with thrown plates and screamed accusations. It was quiet, dignified, and somehow more devastating for its calmness. They had built their love story carefully, brick by brick, and now they dismantled it with the same methodical care. The last time Brendan saw Celine during this period was at their lawyer's office. She wore the same burgundy sweater she'd worn the day they met, though he doubted it was intentional. She looked tired but resolute, signing her name with steady hands to the papers that would end their marriage. As she stood to leave, their eyes met one final time. In that moment, all the love they'd shared, all the dreams they'd built, all the possibilities they'd lost, seemed to pass between them. Then she turned away, and Brendan was left holding the pieces of their shattered future. That night, he finally went back to work, throwing himself into the Shanghai merger with renewed intensity. If he worked hard enough, stayed late enough, focused completely enough, maybe he could forget the sound of her laughter, the way she looked in morning light, the feeling of completeness he'd only ever found in her arms. But even as he built his empire of numbers and negotiations, a part of him knew the truth. He had traded the real treasure for its shadow, and no amount of success would ever fill the Celine-shaped void in his heart. Chapter 7. The Aftermath. The divorce proceedings unfolded with the same precision Brendan applied to his financial deals, and the attention to detail Celine brought to her architectural restorations. Their lawyers' offices became neutral ground, a sterile environment where 5 years of marriage were systematically dismantled. The division of assets was methodical. The penthouse went on the market. Neither could bear to live there among the ghosts of their happiness. Their art collection, carefully curated over years of gallery openings and auction houses, was split according to who had chosen each piece. Even their shared memories seemed to require cataloguing and distribution. Brendan threw himself into the Shanghai merger with renewed intensity. The deal that had contributed to their marriage's demise became his sanctuary, a place where emotional complications could be reduced to numbers on spreadsheets. His corner office on the 50th floor grew larger, the view more impressive, but the emptiness inside him expanded even faster. One particularly dark evening, 6 months after signing the divorce papers, he stood at his office window, watching the city lights flicker like distant stars. A half-empty glass of scotch sat on his desk next to the latest financial reports showing record profits. The Shanghai merger had been an unprecedented success, earning him accolades throughout the financial world. Success tasted like ashes in his mouth. His phone buzzed, another message from Alexandra checking in from Australia. She'd been their mutual friend from college, and now she watched helplessly as they navigated their separate lives. "How are you holding up?" her text read. Brendan stared at the message, remembering how Alexandra had been there from the beginning, witnessing their love story unfold in that university library. Now she was witness to its aftermath, trying to maintain friendships with both of them across oceans and time zones. "Busy," he replied, the standard answer he gave everyone these days. But then, because it was Alexandra, and because it was late, and because the scotch had loosened something in his chest, he added, "The city feels empty without her." Across town in her newly purchased brownstone in Greenwich Village, Celine was also awake. Her restoration projects had taken on new life after the divorce, as if she poured all her unexpressed emotions into breathing life back into broken things. The Williams Theatre renovation had been a triumph, earning her recognition in architectural circles and a steady stream of high-profile commissions. But tonight, surrounded by blueprints and material samples, she found herself sketching their old apartment instead. Every line on the paper brought back memories: the kitchen where they'd cooked Sunday brunches, the balcony where they'd planned their future, the bedroom where they'd made love and fought and finally grown apart. Her phone lit up with a message from Alexandra. "Just checked on Brendan. He's working too hard, just like you." Celine set down her pencil, studying the sketch she'd unconsciously created. "We always did have that in common," she wrote back. As summer turned to autumn, they developed new routines, new ways of moving through the city without crossing paths. Brendan joined an exclusive gym in the financial district, working out his frustrations before dawn. Celine found solace in evening yoga classes, learning to breathe through the pain of loss. Their friends divided themselves naturally, like water finding its own level. The financial crowd gravitated to Brendan, the creative circle to Celine. Only Alexandra refused to choose sides, maintaining her connections to both with stubborn determination. Brendan's penthouse in a sleek new high-rise grew more minimalist with each passing month. Every trace of Celine's warmth gradually replaced by chrome and glass. He dated occasionally beautiful women who understood the demands of his career because they had similar ones of their own. But none of them read Pride and Prejudice. None of them debated architecture over tiramisu. None of them looked at him the way Celine had in that library. One evening, he found himself walking past Bella Notte, their old favorite restaurant. Through the window, he could see Giuseppe still presiding over his domain, greeting customers like long-lost family. Before he could stop himself, he walked in. "Signor Brendan." Giuseppe's face lit up, then fell slightly as he realized Celine wasn't with him. "Ah, it has been too long. Your table, it misses you both." "Just me tonight, Giuseppe," Brendan said softly, following the old man to what had been their regular spot. The menu hadn't changed, but everything else had. He ordered their usual wine out of habit, then felt his throat tighten when Giuseppe brought 2 glasses before catching himself and removing one with a murmured apology. Meanwhile, Celine's professional success continued to grow. She became known for breathing new life into historic buildings, though she couldn't help but see the irony in restoring everything except her own broken heart. Her work took her across the city, each project a chance to lose herself in the challenge of preservation and renewal. She dated 2, an artist, a professor, even another architect. They were interesting men with passion and intelligence, but none of them understood how she could spend hours talking about the soul of a building. None of them quoted poetry while making her morning coffee. None of them were Brendan. The closest they came to meeting was at a charity gala at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Celine had restored several of the museum's period rooms, and Brendan's firm was a major donor. They spotted each other across the grand hall, she in a deep blue gown that made his heart stop, he in a tuxedo that reminded her of their wedding day. For a moment, their eyes met across the crowded room. The years fell away, and they were back in that library, young and in love and full of possibilities. Then someone stepped between them, breaking the connection, and when the path cleared again, both had retreated to opposite ends of the hall. Alexandra received 2 separate phone calls that night. "I saw her, Alex." Brendan's voice was rough. "She looked beautiful. Happy." "I saw him," Celine whispered hours later. "He hasn't changed, but somehow he's completely different." Life continued its relentless march forward. Brendan expanded his influence in the financial world, while Celine's restoration projects grew more ambitious. They built separate lives, successful by any external measure, but both carried an awareness of something missing, like a building with perfect structure but no soul. 3 years after their divorce, Celine was featured in Architectural Digest for her work on a historic opera house. The article included a photo of her standing in the restored Grand Hall, looking elegant and professional in a cream-colored suit. Brendan kept the magazine in his desk drawer, though he told himself it was just to keep up with industry news. 4 years in, Brendan made Forbes' 40 Under 40 list. The profile mentioned his dedication to his work, his innovative approach to investment banking, his philanthropic contributions. Celine saw the article online and found herself tracing his face on the screen, noting the new lines around his eyes, the slight grey at his temples that made him look distinguished. Their influence on each other lingered in unexpected ways. Brendan found himself advocating for historical preservation in his real estate investments. Celine incorporated modern financial planning into her restoration projects. They had shaped each other in ways that survived their separation. One particularly late night, Brendan stood in his new office, looking out over the city. From his vantage point, he could see several buildings Celine had restored, each one a testament to her vision and talent. He wondered if she ever looked up at the financial district's towers, if she ever thought about him working late into the night. At that same moment, Celine sat in her restored brownstone, working on plans for her latest project. But her eyes kept drifting to a small photo hidden in her desk. Them at Bellanotte, young and in love, before success and ambition had torn them apart. Their lives had become a study in parallel lines, moving in the same direction but never intersecting. They achieved everything they'd thought they wanted, only to discover that success without someone to share it with was the hollowest victory of all. Alexandra watched from Australia as her two best friends lived their separate lives, never quite intersecting, but never fully separating either. She saw how they both threw themselves into their work, how they both achieved incredible success, and how they both carried an emptiness that no achievement could fill. "You two are the most brilliant idiots I know," she wrote in her journal one night. "You restore buildings and build financial empires, but you can't see what's right in front of you, that some things are worth more than success, and some breaks can be mended if you're brave enough to try." Little did they know, as they moved through their separate lives in the same city, that fate, with a little help from Alexandra, was about to give them another chance. Sometimes the heart needs time to learn its lessons, and sometimes the longest way around is the shortest way home. Chapter 8. Echoes of the past. 10 years passed. New York City changed around them, but some things remained constant, like Bellanotte, the Italian restaurant where they used to share midnight tiramisu. The small establishment stood unchanged on its quiet corner, a testament to enduring tradition in a city that never stopped evolving. On a warm spring evening, remarkably similar to the night of their first date, Brendan's town car pulled up outside the restaurant. He'd just closed a major infrastructure deal, one that would reshape Manhattan's skyline, but instead of feeling triumphant, he felt hollow. Success had become his constant companion, but it made for a cold bedfellow. Through the familiar windows, he caught sight of her. Celine sat at what had been their table, surrounded by architectural drawings and clients, her passion evident in her animated gestures. The years had been kind to her. She was more beautiful than ever, success and confidence adding a new dimension to her natural grace. Her hair was elegantly styled, shorter than during their marriage, but still framing her face in the way that had always made his heart skip. She wore a deep burgundy dress that painfully reminded him of the sweater she'd worn the day they met. Her hands moved expressively as she explained something to her clients, sketching in the air the way she used to do when describing her visions to him. Giuseppe spotted him through the window and started to wave, but Brendan quickly shook his head, retreating into the gathering darkness before Celine could notice his presence. His driver asked if he wanted to stop somewhere else for dinner, but he'd lost his appetite. Instead, he found himself typing an email to Alexandra. "Saw Celine today at Bellanotte. She hasn't changed. Still lights up a room just by being in it. Why does it still hurt after all these years? The Shanghai merger was supposed to be worth the cost, but standing there tonight, watching her through the window, I can't remember why I thought any success could be worth losing her." Inside the restaurant, unaware of her former husband's presence, Celine was struggling to maintain her professional composure. This table held too many memories: first dates, anniversary celebrations, quiet Sunday brunches that stretched into evening. Giuseppe still gave her the same knowing look he'd given them years ago, though now it carried a tinge of sadness. As her clients discussed budget constraints and historical preservation requirements for her latest project, the restoration of a historic theater in Brooklyn, Celine's mind wandered to the past. She remembered Brendan's laugh, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, how he used to reach across the table to take her hand mid-conversation. The meeting concluded successfully. They always did these days. But Celine lingered, ordering an espresso and tiramisu. Giuseppe brought it himself, along with a gentle pat on her shoulder. "He comes here sometimes too, you know," the old man said softly, his Italian accent thicker with emotion. Always alone, always looking at your table. Celine's hand trembled slightly as she lifted her coffee cup. Giuseppe, please. 10 years is a long time to be apart from your heart, Bella, he said, his wisdom earned through decades of watching love stories unfold in his restaurant. The food tastes better when shared, no? Later that night, in her beautifully restored brownstone, Celine found herself writing to Alexandra. Alexandra, you won't believe who I glimpsed outside Bella Notte today. Brendan. He looked distinguished with touches of grey at his temples. Funny how time heals everything, except the one wound you can't forget. I've restored dozens of buildings since our divorce, but I can't seem to restore my own heart. The next morning, Brendan buried himself in work, trying to forget the image of Celine at their old table. His office on the 60th floor offered spectacular views of the city, but his eyes kept being drawn to the historic buildings she'd restored, each one a testament to her vision and talent. His assistant interrupted his brooding with news about a new development project. The company was planning to demolish an old theatre to build luxury condominiums. Something about the proposal bothered him, and it took a moment to realize why. It was the kind of building Celine would fight to save. Without fully understanding his own motives, Brendan found himself researching the theatre's history. It had opened in 1920, hosted countless legendary performances, survived the Great Depression and New York's darkest days. It deserved better than demolition. He made some calls, pulled some strings, and by afternoon had arranged for the building to be considered for historical preservation status. His colleagues were puzzled by his sudden interest in architectural conservation, but he brushed off their questions with vague comments about community relations. Across town, Celine was presenting her latest restoration plans to the Historical Society when she noticed something interesting, a last-minute addition to the preservation list. The Martin Theatre, saved from demolition by an anonymous benefactor. She recognized the writing style in the proposal, the precise attention to financial details that could only come from one person. During a break, she found herself standing outside his office building, looking up at the towering glass structure. Somewhere up there, Brendan was probably orchestrating another million-dollar deal. Did he ever look down and see her buildings? Did he recognize her touch in the restored facades and renovated landmarks that now dotted the city? The doorman recognized her, some faces you don't forget even after a decade. Mrs. Guptill. I mean, Miss Stone. I'm sorry. It's all right, Thomas, she said softly. They both pretended not to notice the tears in her eyes as she turned away. That evening, Brendan left work early for the first time in years. He found himself walking through the city, past buildings that held memories of their life together. The art gallery, where they'd had their first fight. The park where he'd proposed. The hotel where they'd spent their first night as husband and wife. New York had been their playground once, every street corner holding the possibility of adventure. Now, it felt like a museum of what they'd lost, each landmark a reminder of happiness slipped away. He stopped at a small bookstore, one of the few surviving independent shops in the city. In the classic section, he found a first edition of Pride and Prejudice. Without hesitation, he bought it, though he had no idea what he'd do with it. Meanwhile, Celine sat in her home office, surrounded by the organized chaos of her work. On her desk sat a framed photograph she couldn't bring herself to put away, the two of them at Bella Notte, young and in love, possibilities endless before them. Her phone rang, a client calling about the Martin Theatre Preservation Project. As she discussed potential restoration approaches, she couldn't help but wonder if Brendan would read about it in the papers. Would he recognize her influence in the designs? Would he remember how they used to dream about saving beautiful old buildings together? The next week brought them closer to crossing paths. A charity gala at the Metropolitan Museum of Art couldn't be avoided by either of them. He was a major donor. She had restored several of the period rooms. They arrived separately, moved in different circles, but remained acutely aware of each other's presence. Brendan watched her from across the room, stunning, in a midnight blue gown that made him forget how to breathe. She was surrounded by admirers, other architects and preservationists who recognized her genius. But he noticed how she wouldn't look directly at his side of the room, how she kept one hand pressed against her stomach, a gesture he remembered from their dating days when she was nervous but trying not to show it. Celine felt his eyes on her throughout the evening. He looked devastating in his tuxedo, success and maturity only adding to his natural charm. She caught glimpses of him with various board members and society figures, all eager for the attention of Wall Street's most eligible bachelor. But she saw how his smile never quite reached his eyes, how he kept checking his watch, habits she remembered from charity events during their marriage, when he was putting on a show but longing to be somewhere else. Their closest encounter came near the restored Renaissance room, her work, his funding. They rounded opposite corners at the same moment, and suddenly there was no crowd between them, no buffer of polite society. Time seemed to stop as their eyes met. 1,000 unspoken words passed between them in that moment. He took half a step forward, her name on his lips. She swayed slightly toward him, muscle memory drawing her to his gravity. Then reality crashed back in as other guests approached. They retreated to their separate corners, hearts pounding, both shaken by the force of their connection even after all these years. Later that night, they both reached out to Alexandra, their messages crossing paths in the digital ether. "I almost talked to her tonight," Brendan wrote. "After 10 years, you'd think it would be easier. But one look in her eyes, and I'm back in that library, falling in love for the first time." "He still affects me the same way," Celine confessed. "One glance, and I forget every reason we couldn't make it work. Is it possible to miss someone you see all the time in newspapers and magazines?" Alexandra read their messages with growing frustration. 10 years she'd watched them orbit each other like binary stars, bound by gravity, but never touching. Perhaps it was time for a little intervention. What neither Brendan nor Celine knew was that their friend had finally decided enough was enough. The pieces were in place, the time was right, and Alexandra Martinez was about to remind them that some love stories deserve a second chapter. Chapter 9. The Matchmaker's Plan. Alexandra Martinez sat in her Sydney apartment, reading their emails side by side on her laptop screen. The morning sun streamed through her windows, illuminating decade-old photographs of the three of them in happier times. After 10 years of watching her two best friends nurse their broken hearts, she'd had enough. "These two idiots," she muttered, booking a flight to New York. "Sometimes you need to break down walls to rebuild something stronger." The 20-hour flight gave her plenty of time to plan. She'd watched them dance around each other for a decade, each achieving incredible success while failing at the one thing that truly mattered, finding their way back to each other. As their oldest friend, she felt not just entitled, but obligated to intervene. Alexandra arrived in Manhattan during a perfect autumn afternoon, the kind that had once witnessed Brendan and Celine's first meeting. She checked into the plaza, expensive but necessary for her plan, and immediately set her scheme in motion. Her first meeting was with Brendan, over coffee at a small cafe near his office. He looked immaculate as always in his tailored suit, but she noticed the shadows under his eyes, the slight slump in his shoulders when he thought no one was watching. "You never remarried," she observed, stirring her latte with deliberate casualness. "Never found anyone who measured up," he admitted after a long pause. "To what?" "You know to what, Alex. To who?" She studied him over the rim of her cup. Success had aged him well, distinguished grey at his temples, lines of experience that added character to his handsome face, but his eyes held the same longing she'd seen at the divorce proceedings 10 years ago. "Have you seen her latest work?" she asked. "The Thompson Theatre restoration is magnificent." "I know," he replied too quickly, then caught himself. "I mean, I've read about it." "Read about it?" Alexandra raised an eyebrow. "Or drive by it every evening on your way home?" His silence was answer enough. Later that day, she met Celine for lunch at a rooftop restaurant overlooking Central Park. Her friend was stunning in a cream-colored dress that emphasized her natural elegance. But Alexandra noticed how she kept glancing at the financial district buildings visible in the distance. "The Martin Theatre Preservation," Alexandra said casually. "Interesting how it was saved at the last minute. Anonymous benefactor with surprisingly detailed financial projections." Celine's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her water glass. "It was him, wasn't it? You tell me. You're the one who recognizes his work as easily as he recognizes yours." They talked about other things, projects, travels, mutual friends, but Brendan's presence haunted their conversation like a ghost. Every topic somehow led back to him, every memory touched by his absence. "Your work is amazing," Alexandra said softly. "You've become one of the most respected architects in the city, but you're not happy." "I'm successful," Celine corrected, but the distinction was telling. "When was the last time you were truly happy? Not just satisfied with a project or pleased with an achievement, but really deeply happy." Celine's silence spoke volumes. Back in her hotel room, Alexandra laid out her plan. She'd watched them orbit each other for too long, both too proud or too scared to make the first move. Sometimes love needed a little push, or in this case a carefully orchestrated scheme. She wrote 2 emails. To Brendan, "I know you've been lonely. I have a friend in town who'd love to meet you. The Plaza Hotel, room 1504, Friday at 8 p.m. Trust me." To Celine, "Remember how we used to talk about fate? Be at the Plaza Hotel, room 1504, Friday at 8 p.m. Sometimes the universe needs a little push." Then she made arrangements with the hotel, ensuring everything would be perfect. A bottle of their favorite Barolo, soft lighting, and most importantly, no escape route. They would have to face each other and the feelings they'd been avoiding for a decade. The next few days were a dance of careful preparation. Alexandra met with each of them separately, planting seeds of possibility, rekindling memories of their shared past. With Brendan, she visited his office, noting how he still kept a photo of Celine hidden in his desk drawer. "You've built an empire," she said, looking out over the city. "But what's the point of having everything if you share it with no one?" He stood beside her, hands in his pockets. "Some things can't be fixed with money." "True," she agreed, "but some things can be fixed with courage." Her conversations with Celine were equally pointed. They walked through the historic districts she'd helped preserve, each building a testament to her belief in second chances. "Your work is about giving old buildings new life," Alexandra observed as they passed the Thompson Theatre. "Don't you think some relationships deserve the same opportunity?" Celine stopped walking, her eyes fixed on the restored facade. "Buildings are easier. They don't have hearts to break." "No," Alexandra agreed, "but neither do they have hearts to heal." The day before her plan was to unfold, Alexandra visited Bella Notte. Giuseppe recognized her immediately, embracing her with typical Italian warmth. "Ah, Signorina Alexandra, you come to talk about our 2 lost souls, yes?" She smiled. "They're not lost, Giuseppe, just temporarily misplaced, and I intend to help them find their way back." The old man's eyes twinkled. "About time. 10 years I watched them come here separately, each looking at the other's empty chair. Not natural, 2 hearts beating alone when they should beat together." She enlisted his help, arranging for a special delivery to room 1504. The same tiramisu that had witnessed their first date, their wedding celebration, and countless moments in between. The pieces were in place. Alexandra had watched them achieve everything they thought they wanted, only to discover success was hollow without someone to share it with. She'd seen them build careers on bringing beauty back to broken things, while their own broken relationship gathered dust in the corners of their hearts. Now, sitting in her hotel room the night before her plan was to unfold, she felt a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. What if they weren't ready? What if 10 years was too long? What if they'd built their walls too high? But then she remembered the way they still looked at each other across crowded rooms, the way they followed each other's careers from afar, the way neither had truly moved on despite a decade of trying. No, 10 years wasn't too long. It was just long enough for them to learn what really mattered, to understand that success meant nothing without love, that all the money and accolades in the world couldn't fill the space left by a soulmate's absence. Tomorrow, they would finally face each other, not across a crowded charity gala or through the pages of magazines, but in the intimate space she'd created for them. And maybe, just maybe, they would find their way back to the love that had never really died, just gotten lost in the chaos of ambition and pride. Alexandra smiled as she made the final arrangements. Sometimes the heart needs time to learn its lessons, and sometimes it needs a friend willing to give it a little push in the right direction. Tomorrow, Brendan and Celine would have their second chance. The only question was whether they would be brave enough to take it. Chapter 10. The Setup. Friday dawned with a crisp autumn breeze that carried memories of libraries and first meetings. Alexandra stood at her Plaza Hotel window, watching New York City come alive beneath a perfect blue sky. After a decade of watching her best friends dance around their lingering feelings, she had finally decided to take action. She'd arrived from Sydney 3 days earlier, using her sabbatical from the university to put her plan in motion. The suite she'd booked at the Plaza wasn't just any room. It was 1504, the same suite where Brendan and Celine had spent their wedding night. Every detail had been carefully considered, from the Barolo breathing on the sideboard to the tiramisu Giuseppe had promised to deliver personally. Across town, Brendan sat in his corner office, unable to focus on the morning's trading reports. Alexandra's invitation kept drawing his attention away from the numbers. "I know you've been lonely. I have a friend in town who'd love to meet you. The Plaza Hotel, room 1504, Friday at 8 p.m. Trust me." Something about her message felt different, weighted with possibility. He found himself thinking about what to wear, then laughed at his own nervousness. When was the last time he'd worried about his appearance for a simple dinner meeting? He pulled up the Plaza's website, studying the familiar facade. How many times had he and Celine stayed there during their marriage? How many mornings had they shared room service coffee on crisp hotel sheets, planning their day in whispered conversations? In her Greenwich Village brownstone, Celine was equally distracted. She'd changed outfits 3 times already, finally settling on a deep burgundy dress that she told herself wasn't chosen for its resemblance to a certain sweater from long ago. Alexandra's cryptic message played through her mind. "Remember how we used to talk about fate? Be at the Plaza Hotel, room 1504, Friday at 8 p.m. Sometimes the universe needs a little push." The words had stirred something in her. Hope, perhaps, or maybe just memories she'd thought safely buried. She found herself touching up her makeup with extra care, applying the jasmine perfume she hadn't worn in years. The day passed with excruciating slowness. Alexandra kept herself busy with final preparations, checking and rechecking every detail. The Plaza's staff had been discreetly informed of her plan, ensuring no well-meaning interruptions would disturb what was to come. She'd arranged the room carefully, fresh flowers in crystal vases, soft lighting that would flatter them both, and 2 envelopes placed on the side table, one marked Brendan, the other Celine. Inside each, she'd written her heart out. Dearest Brendan, some mistakes are worth fixing. Some loves are worth fighting for. You've built an empire, but what good is a kingdom if you sit on the throne alone? She still loves you. She's never stopped. The question is, are you brave enough to try again? With love, Alexandra. Dearest Celine, you've restored so many beautiful things, given new life to forgotten treasures. Isn't it time you restored the most important thing of all? He looks for you in every crowd, sees you in every beautiful building. Some foundations are too strong to crumble completely. The question is, are you ready to rebuild? With love, Alexandra. At 6 o'clock, she sent 2 final messages. To Brendan, don't be late. Some opportunities only come once in a lifetime, or twice if you're very lucky. To Celine, wear your heart on your sleeve tonight. Second chances are rare, but sometimes they're exactly what we need. In his penthouse, Brendan stood before his closet, finally selecting a charcoal grey suit that Celine had always loved. He caught himself in this thought, wondering why her opinions still influenced his choices after all these years. As he adjusted his tie, the deep blue one she'd given him for their 2nd anniversary, his hands trembled slightly. He found himself remembering their first date, how nervous he'd been then, how certain that she was someone special. 10 years later, his heart raced with the same anticipation, though he didn't quite understand why. Meanwhile, Celine sat at her vanity, applying the jasmine perfume she'd worn on their first date. She told herself it was merely habit, not a deliberate choice, but she couldn't deny the flutter in her stomach as she watched the clock inch toward 8. Her phone buzzed with a message from a client about the Martin Theatre restoration, but for once, work couldn't hold her attention. Her mind kept drifting to room 1504, to memories of champagne and promises, of love that had seemed unbreakable. At 7:30, Alexandra made one last check of the room. The Barolo was breathing, the lighting was perfect, and Giuseppe's tiramisu waited in elegant presentation. She'd arranged everything to echo their past while creating space for a new future. Life's too short for pride, she whispered to herself as she placed the envelopes on the side table. Then she left, knowing her part was done. The rest would be up to them. At 7:45, Brendan's town car pulled up to the plaza. He adjusted his cuffs, a nervous gesture he'd picked up during his early days on Wall Street. The doorman greeted him by name. He was still a regular at the hotel's bar, though he never spoke about why he kept returning to this particular establishment. At 7:50, Celine's taxi arrived. She paid the driver and stood for a moment, looking up at the familiar facade. How many times had she and Brendan stayed here? How many memories lived within these walls? She pushed the thoughts aside and walked in, her heels clicking softly on the marble floor. The lobby was exactly as she remembered, elegant, timeless, like the buildings she restored. A young couple stood at the check-in desk, reminding her of another young couple who had once believed in forever. At 7:55, they entered separate elevators, each lost in their own thoughts, neither aware of the other's presence. Brendan straightened his tie one last time. Celine touched up her lipstick in the elevator's mirrored wall. The 15th floor was quiet, the thick carpeting muffling their approaching footsteps. Room 1504 waited at the end of the hall, its polished brass numbers gleaming in the soft light. At precisely 8 p.m., they reached the door from opposite directions. Their eyes met across the hallway, and time seemed to stop. Celine's breath caught in her throat. Brendan looked devastating in his charcoal suit, the grey at his temples only adding to his appeal. Success had matured him, adding gravitas to his natural charm, but his eyes, those eyes that had first captured her attention in the library, were exactly the same. Brendan couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Celine was a vision in burgundy, the colour bringing out the warmth in her skin, the subtle highlights in her hair. She'd cut it shorter over the years, the elegant style emphasizing her graceful neck. She was more beautiful than ever, confidence and success only enhancing her natural radiance. They stood frozen, neither approaching nor retreating, caught in a moment of recognition and shock. The hallway seemed to shrink until nothing existed except the space between them, charged with 10 years of unspoken words and unfulfilled longings. "What are you?" They began simultaneously, then stopped, ghost of a smile touching both their lips at the familiar synchronicity. Before either could complete the thought, the door to 1504 opened. Alexandra stood there looking utterly unapologetic. "Finally," she said, stepping back to reveal the carefully prepared room. "I was beginning to think you'd both lost the ability to be punctual." The stage was set for a reunion neither of them expected, but both had secretly longed for every day of their 10 years apart. Chapter 11. The Hotel Room. Brendan's heart raced as he inserted the keycard into room 1504 of the plaza, his fingers trembling slightly against the brass handle. The door swung open silently, revealing Celine perched on the edge of the king-sized bed, as beautiful and devastating as ever in her burgundy dress. The soft lamplight caught the highlights in her hair, creating a halo effect that made his breath catch in his throat. Their eyes met across the room, a decade of unspoken words hanging in the air between them. The familiar scent of her jasmine perfume mingled with the aroma of Giuseppe's tiramisu, creating an intoxicating mixture of past and present. I should go," he stammered, turning toward the door, his heart thundering so loudly he was sure she could hear it. "Wait." Celine's voice stopped him, soft but firm. 10 years, Brendan. 10 years of pretending I don't miss you every day." He turned back slowly, drinking in the sight of her. Time had been kind. She was more beautiful than ever, success and confidence only enhancing her natural grace. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, the only sign of her own nervousness. "I drive by your office sometimes," he confessed, the words tumbling out before he could stop them, "just to catch a glimpse of you through the window. I still have your mother's copy of Pride and Prejudice," she whispered. "I couldn't bring myself to return it." The air between them crackled with tension as they gravitated toward each other, drawn by a force neither could resist. Brendan noticed Alexandra's letters on the side table, but they seemed unimportant now. Nothing mattered except the way Celine's eyes held his, full of memories and possibilities. "You look beautiful," he said softly, stopping just out of reach. "Success suits you." "You too," she replied, a slight tremor in her voice. "Though the grey is new." Her hand reached up instinctively to touch his temple, then froze halfway, remembering they'd lost the right to such casual intimacy, but Brendan caught her fingers, pressing them gently to the silver strands she'd noticed. The contact sent electricity through both of them. Celine's breath hitched as his thumb traced small circles on her palm, a gesture so familiar it made her heart ache. "I thought I was meeting a friend of Alexandra's," he said, still holding her hand. "And I thought the universe was sending me a sign." A small smile played at her lips. "I suppose Alexandra is playing both friend and universe tonight. She always did know us better than we knew ourselves." They were standing close now, close enough that Brendan could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes, close enough to notice how her pulse fluttered at her throat. The burgundy dress hugged her curves in a way that made his mouth go dry, while the slit at the side revealed a tantalizing glimpse of leg. "Would you like some wine?" he asked, spotting the bottle of Barolo breathing on the dresser. "For old time's sake?" "I'd like that," she nodded, and they both pretended not to notice how their hands shook as they reached for the glasses. The wine was perfect, of course. Alexandra had thought of everything. They sat on the edge of the bed, careful to maintain a small distance between them, though every fibre of their beings yearned to close it. "Do you remember our first bottle of Barolo?" Celine asked, swirling the ruby liquid in her glass. "At Bella Notte," Brendan smiled at the memory. "Giuseppe insisted it would make the stars shine brighter." "He was right," she said softly. "Everything seemed brighter back then." The weight of the past settled around them like a familiar blanket. They sipped their wine in comfortable silence, each lost in memories of shared moments and missed opportunities. "I saw what you did with the Martin Theatre," Celine said finally. "The anonymous benefactor with surprisingly detailed financial projections." Brendan had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "You always said it deserved to be saved." "And I saw your name on the Thompson Theatre donor wall, the highest private contribution. It was a worthy project," he shrugged. The restoration plans were brilliant. They shared a knowing look, acknowledging how they'd stayed connected even in their separation, supporting each other's dreams from a safe distance. "We were young," Brendan said suddenly, "too proud to admit our mistakes, too scared to fight for what mattered," Celine added, setting down her wineglass. The movement brought her closer to him, their thighs almost touching. The tension in the room shifted, becoming something more intimate, more dangerous. Brendan could hear his heart pounding in his ears as Celine's perfume enveloped him, bringing back a flood of memories. Their first kiss on her doorstep, their wedding night in this very hotel, countless moments of passion and tenderness. Without conscious thought, his hand found her face, thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. She leaned into his touch, eyes closing at the familiar comfort of his palm against her cheek. "I never stopped loving you," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. Celine's eyes opened, meeting his with an intensity that took his breath away. "I never stopped loving you either." The kiss, when it came, was both gentle and desperate, tentative and passionate. His lips found hers with the certainty of muscle memory, while her hands clutched at his lapels, pulling him closer. She tasted of wine and memories and hope. Brendan's fingers tangled in her hair as the kiss deepened, years of longing pouring out in a moment of connection. Celine melted against him, fitting perfectly in his arms just as she always had. They broke apart, breathing heavily, foreheads pressed together. The world had narrowed to this room, this moment, this second chance they'd been given. "We should talk," Celine murmured, though her hands were already working on his tie. "We should," Brendan agreed, pressing kisses along her jaw. "About everything." But talking seemed impossible as passion overtook them. His jacket fell to the floor, followed by his tie. Celine's dress whispered against the carpet as she stood, turning so he could lower the zipper with trembling fingers. The sight of her in black lace underthings nearly stopped his heart. She was more beautiful than ever, success having added a confidence to her natural grace that took his breath away. Her skin glowed in the soft lamplight as she stood before him, vulnerable yet strong. "You're stunning," he breathed, drinking in the sight of her. A blush colored her cheeks at his words, the same shy smile he remembered from their first time together playing at her lips. She reached for him, fingers working on the buttons of his shirt with practiced ease. Their coming together was like a storm, breaking after years of drought. Passionate yet tender, desperate yet careful. They rediscovered each other slowly, mapping changes and constants, finding familiar spots that still drew gasps and sighs. Afterward, they lay tangled in the luxurious sheets, Celine's head on his chest, his fingers tracing patterns on her bare shoulder. The city lights twinkled beyond the windows, but neither noticed, too absorbed in their own private universe. "What happens now?" Celine asked softly, pressing a kiss to his collarbone. "Whatever we want," Brendan replied, pulling her closer. "We're not the same people we were 10 years ago." "No," she agreed, propping herself up to look at him. We're not. That's what scares me. He understood her fear. They'd built separate lives, achieved individual success, grown in different ways. But maybe that was exactly what they'd needed. Time to become the people who could make their love work. I'm not saying it will be easy, he said, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. But I think we've both learned what matters most. Success means nothing if you have no one to share it with. Celine's eyes filled with tears as she nodded. I've restored so many beautiful old buildings, she whispered. But the one thing I really wanted to fix, I was too afraid to try. We both were, he admitted. But maybe that's what we needed, time to appreciate what we had, what we lost, what we could be again. They talked through the night, really talked, about everything they'd missed in each other's lives, about their fears and hopes, their regrets and dreams, about how they'd grown and changed, and how maybe those changes made them better suited for each other now than they'd been before. As dawn began to paint the sky in soft pastels, they stood together at the window, Celine wrapped in the sheet, Brendan in his dress pants. The city was waking up below them, but they were in no hurry to rejoin the world. I love you, he said simply, pressing a kiss to her temple. I never stopped. I love you too, she replied, turning in his arms. Always have, always will. They knew there would be challenges ahead. Their lives wouldn't magically merge without effort. Their past hurts wouldn't heal overnight. But standing there in the morning light, they felt something they hadn't in years. Hope. As if reading their thoughts, a note slipped under the door. Alexandra's handwriting was instantly recognizable. Some love stories need a second chapter. Some buildings need time to settle before they can be properly restored. Some hearts need to break before they can be rebuilt stronger. Take care of each other this time. Love, Alex. Brendan and Celine smiled at their friend's words, knowing she was right. They had been given a second chance, and this time they wouldn't waste it. Breakfast? Brendan suggested, pressing a kiss to Celine's bare shoulder. In a minute, she replied, turning in his arms. I'm not quite ready to share you with the world yet. Their lips met in another kiss, gentle but full of promise. Outside, New York City continued its endless dance, but in room 1504 of the Plaza Hotel, time stood still as two hearts found their way home again. Chapter 12. Coming Home. Their reconciliation was neither quick nor easy. They spent months in couples therapy, learning to communicate better and understand each other's needs. This time, they built their relationship on a foundation of hard-won wisdom and mutual respect. I was wrong, Brendan admitted during one session, reaching for Celine's hand. Success means nothing without someone to share it with. And I was too quick to give up, Celine responded. Some things are worth fighting for. They remarried in the same Victorian mansion as before, but this time Alexandra was their only witness. Celine wore a simple ivory silk gown that made Brendan's heart stop when he first saw her. The afternoon sun streamed through the restored stained glass windows, bathing her in rainbow light as she walked toward him. I, Brendan, take you, Celine, as my wife once more, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Not as the man I was, but as the man you helped me become. I promise to love you, not just in grand moments, but in quiet ones. To see you, hear you, and choose you every single day of our lives. Tears sparkled in Celine's eyes as she replied, I, Celine, take you, Brendan, as my husband again, with the wisdom of our past and the promise of our future. I vow to build our love stronger each day, to cherish what we have, and to never again take for granted the miracle of finding your soulmate. Their kiss was gentle yet passionate, filled with promises and possibilities. Alexandra wiped away tears as she watched her two best friends find their way back to each other. 2 years later, as they held their newborn son James in their arms, Brendan kissed Celine's forehead with infinite tenderness. She was radiant despite her exhaustion, more beautiful than ever as she cradled their child. "We had to break apart to build something stronger," she whispered, watching their baby's peaceful face. Little James had Brendan's chin and Celine's eyes, a perfect blend of them both. "Like the buildings you restore," Brendan replied, his voice trembling with joy. "Sometimes the most beautiful structures rise from ruins." "And sometimes," Celine smiled, leaning back against him as James gripped her finger with his tiny hand, "the best love stories need a second chapter." Alexandra, named as James's godmother, watched from the doorway of the hospital room with tears in her eyes. "Some buildings," she said softly, "just need the right architect to realize their true potential." That evening, after James had been settled in the hospital nursery and Alexandra had gone home, Brendan and Celine stood together at the window of her private room. The Manhattan skyline sparkled before them, and somewhere in the distance, a street musician played La Vie en Rose on a saxophone. "Dance with me," Brendan whispered, taking her in his arms. "Here," Celine laughed softly, "in my hospital gown. Here, now, always." He pulled her close, swaying gently to the distant music. "You've never been more beautiful than you are right now." She rested her head on his shoulder, breathing in his familiar scent. "We did it," she murmured. "We found our way back." "We did more than that," he replied, pressing a kiss to her temple. "We built something stronger, something lasting, like your restorations. We kept the best of what we had before, but made it better, more beautiful." "I love you," she said, lifting her face to his. "More today than yesterday, less than tomorrow." "I love you," he responded, cupping her face in his hands, "for all our chapters, past and future." As they stood there in the quiet hospital room, their newborn son sleeping peacefully nearby, they knew they had found something rare and precious, not just a second chance at love, but a deeper understanding of what love truly meant. It wasn't just about passion or romance, but about choice and commitment, about growing together and supporting each other's dreams. Their story was proof that true love never dies. It simply waits for hearts to grow wise enough to nurture it, brave enough to fight for it, and strong enough to let it flourish. In each other's arms, they had found not just love, but understanding, not just passion, but partnership, not just a happy ending, but an endless beginning. "Look," Celine whispered, pointing out the window. A shooting star streaked across the night sky, a cosmic celebration of their joy. "Make a wish," Brendan said, holding her closer. She turned in his arms, eyes shining with happiness. "I already have everything I could ever wish for. You, James, our love. This is better than any dream." Their lips met in a tender kiss, full of promise and possibility. Outside, the city continued its endless dance, but in that quiet room, time stood still as two hearts, once broken but now healed, beat in perfect harmony. This wasn't just a reunion or a second chance, it was the beginning of their greatest adventure yet. Together, they would build a life filled with love, laughter, and endless possibilities, proving that sometimes the most beautiful love stories are the ones that take the longest to write. "Welcome home," they whispered together. And in that moment, surrounded by the glow of new parenthood and rekindled love, they knew that they had finally found their truest happiness, not in success or achievement, but in the simple, profound joy of loving and being loved in return.